Good evening. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you to this session with the legendary Mr. Ruskin Bond and Mr. Jeet Thayil, which to my mind is aptly titled Lovely, Dark and Deep. Tata Steel is privileged to be the title sponsor of the Kolkata Literary Meet 2015. We've always supported and partnered with organizations and initiatives that aim to foster and encourage intellectual and cultural pursuits in society. We are committed to deepening our engagement with civil society and cultural moorings of this region as we move ahead. In fact, this was the driving force behind coming here and supporting this in Kolkata, because we have been in the East and we are invested in the East and we want to grow in the East, and we certainly want the Eastern region to have its own share of such events. It's now my pleasure to introduce eminent speakers to you. What can one say of Mr. Bond, winner of the Sahitya Academy Award, the Padma Shri and the Padma Bhushan, and his first novel was published when he was just 21. Since then, he has written more than 300 short stories, essays and novels, including Vagrants in the Valley, The Blue Umbrella, Funny Side Up, and A Flight of Pigeons. He has also written more than 30 books for children. Most of his work has been influenced by his life in the hill stations at the foothills of the Himalayas, where he spent his childhood. His book, Flight of Pigeons, has been adapted into the film Junoon. A Room on the Roof has been adapted into a television serial produced by BBC, and several of his stories have been incorporated in school curriculum in India, including The Night Train at Deoli, Time Stops at Shamli, and Trees Still Grow in Dera. In 2007, a film for children based on his popular novel for children, The Blue Umbrella, won the National Award in the Best Children's Film category. The other speaker at the session is Mr. Jeet Thayil, who is best known as a poet, novelist, and a musician. His first novel, Necropolis, won the DSC Prize for South Asia Literature and was shortlisted for the 2012 Man Booker Prize and the Hindu Literary Prize. His well-known collections include These Errors Are Correct, English, Apocalypso, and Gemini. For These Errors Are Correct, he won the Sahitya Award in the English category. Besides his credentials as a writer, he is also known as a songwriter and a guitarist, and in the early 80s, he was also guitarist for the psychedelic rock band Atomic Forest. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I hand over the session to Mr. Sandip Roy, who will take you through an engaging conversation with Mr. Ruskin Bond and Mr. Jeet Thayil on Ghosts, Black Windows, charasis, and more. Over to you, Mr. Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Narendran. I'd like to invite Jeet Thayil and Sandip Roy. It's also a very special day for Sandip. Sandip has been with the Literary Meet for all 4 editions. He's been very, very obliging, read books in 3 hours to moderate sessions, and it gives me a very special joy to get his book launched by Mr. Bond and Jeet here. So I just request them to unwrap the books. The book is Don't Let Him Know, and it's available at the bookstore near the East Gate. Over to you, Sandip.
All right. Thank you very much, both of you. It's very special to have the book launched here like this at the Kolkata Literary Meet. And but to get on with what we really want to talk about, which is ghosts. My book doesn't have a ghost, unfortunately, so I can't tie it into this conversation. But I thought it was a little daring, I guess, of us to decide to have a conversation about ghosts while sitting here in the Victoria Memorial after dark with, it's like sort of tempting fate, but we will be brave and with bright lights go ahead with it. But I thought maybe to set the mood for it, we could hear a little bit of one of Ruskin Bond's most famous ghost stories. And it was, in fact, one that was one of the first ones I encountered. And I remember reading it twice because it was kind of one of those pleasurable chills that you get, and so you read it. But I thought it'll be kind of interesting to actually have Jeet read the story and for Ruskin Bond to actually listen to his story. So, Jeet.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here with Mr. Ruskin Bond, and of course to help launch Sandip's book. I'm going to read a story called A Face in the Dark, and the amazing thing about this story is its brevity. It's a marvel of economy. It's only a little over 2 pages, but I think it's pretty guaranteed to give you a little shiver at the end. Here is A Face in the Dark. Mr. Oliver, an Anglo-Indian teacher, was returning to his school late one night on the outskirts of the hill station of Shimla. From before Kipling's time, the school had been run on English public school lines, and the boys, most of them from wealthy Indian families, wore blazers, caps, and ties. Life magazine, in a feature on India, had once called it the Eton of the East. Mr. Oliver had been teaching in the school for several years. The Shimla Bazaar, with its cinemas and restaurants, was about 3 miles from the school, and Mr. Oliver, a bachelor, usually strolled into the town in the evening, returning after dark, when he would take a shortcut through the pine forest. When there was a strong wind, the pine trees made sad, eerie sounds that kept most people to the main road. But Mr. Oliver was not a nervous or imaginative man. He carried a torch, and its gleam, the batteries were running down, moved fitfully down the narrow forest path. When its flickering light fell on the figure of a boy who was sitting alone on a rock, Mr. Oliver stopped. Boys were not supposed to be out after dark. "What are you doing out here, boy?" asked Mr. Oliver sharply, moving closer so that he could recognize the miscreant. But even as he approached the boy, Mr. Oliver sensed that something was wrong. The boy appeared to be crying. His head hung down. He held his face in his hands, and his body shook convulsively. It was a strange, soundless weeping, and Mr. Oliver felt distinctly uneasy. "Well, what's the matter?" he asked, his anger giving way to concern. "What are you crying for?" The boy would not answer or look up. His body continued to be racked with silent sobbing. "Come on, boy, you shouldn't be out here at this hour. Tell me the trouble. Look up." The boy looked up. He took his hands from his face and looked up at his teacher. The light from Mr. Oliver's torch fell on the boy's face, if you could call it a face. It had no eyes, ears, nose, or mouth. It was just a round, smooth head with a school cap on top of it. And that's where the story should end. But for Mr. Oliver, it did not end here. The torch fell from his trembling hand. He turned and scrambled down the path, running blindly through the trees and calling for help. He was still running towards the school buildings when he saw a lantern swinging in the middle of the path. Mr. Oliver stumbled up to the watchman, gasping for breath. "What is it, Sahib?" asked the watchman. Has there been an accident? Why are you running? I saw something horrible. A boy weeping in the forest, and he had no face. No face, Sahib? No eyes, no nose, mouth, nothing. Do you mean it was like this, Sahib? Asked the watchman, and raised the lamp to his own face. The watchman had no eyes, no ears, no features at all, not even an eyebrow, and that's when the wind blew the lamp out.
Thank you, Jeet. It sounds much better when you read it.
Very kind of you to say that.
And after the lamp was blown out, there was one more line which somehow my publishers left out. It just said, and that's when Mr. Oliver had his heart attack.
I think it's clear that something like that is coming.
I mean,
Probably
yes, perhaps it was best left.
best to imagine what would happen to Mr. Oliver, whether it's a heart attack or... But Mr. Bond, is there a story behind this story?
Not really. I did go to school in Simla, of course, and they say hill stations are supposed to have ghosts, and I think mostly British ghosts.
He just couldn't leave.
They wouldn't go away. The real people left. They left their ghosts behind. But and whereas in the plains of India, you have a large variety of spooks. You know, bhoots and prates and things like that, and called very mischievous ones who live in peepal trees and jump down your throat if you leave your mouth wide open or yawn. So particularly in rural areas, I don't know about Calcutta, must have its ghosts, and right now, who knows, Queen Victoria might be roaming around at the back over there, just watching over this monument. Ghosts are sort of around us, even if we don't always see them or are aware of them.
Were you, as a child growing up, were you kind of a scared child? Did you think about ghosts much?
No, I didn't really. I think it was only the first book of ghost stories that I read that really made me sort of conscious of ghosts and spirits, and that was a book of stories by M.R. James. Now he was the guru of all ghost story writers back in the 1860s or 70s. He was an academic and taught in a university in England, and a lot of his stories have an academic background, but they're very effective. And he wrote just 2 books of stories, the ghost stories of an antiquary and a warning to the curious. After reading that when I was about 10, 11, I was always looking out for good ghost stories.
What about looking out for good ghosts?
To tell you the truth, in spite of, I'm not really a ghost hunter or a ghostbuster. I don't go looking for them, but they do come looking for me sometimes. And the most prevalent one is the lady who tucks me up late at night. Sometimes I don't sleep too well. I have a restless night, and the blanket or the rosai slips off my bed, and I'm conscious of someone picking it up, putting it back on top of me, tucking me in, and when I put the light on, there's nobody there. So it's I've always thought of it as a motherly ghost, but just the other day somebody said it might be a fatherly ghost. But there's always a sort of perfume in the air which makes me think it's a lady.
It could be a man too. Some men are...
Now men go in for perfumes too, so you never know.
But does this only happen at your home in the hills, or does this motherly ghost follow you to, like the Taj Bengal? Is she tucking you into bed?
No, well, I'm still there one night. There's one night left, so let's see if anybody tucks me into bed tonight.
What about you, Jeet?
I used to think ghosts are like cats. They're housebound. It depends on the place. But no, I think it's absolutely not true. They do follow you around. And I'm sure ghosts are living or dead. Why wouldn't you want to hang out at the Taj Bengal?
But did you when you were growing up, were you interested in ghosts? Was it any part of your fantasy life? Did you see ghosts? I have to admit that when I had a very happy childhood and I had no relationship with ghosts at all. Ghosts are not incompatible with happy childhood.
Well, something happened because it was only as an adult that I came to believe in ghosts. And now I'm a firm believer in ghosts. I think you'd be a fool not to. The air is populated with figures.
I notice the audience is drifting away quietly, I think some of them.
Some of them
are getting a bit worried.
But, Mr. Bond, you'd also written in a book where you'd said, it's not about believing in ghosts or not, but that you used to have visions of your father.
Yes, that happened many, many years back. But not in recent years, yes. And most of the ghosts that I write about or that I experience are usually very friendly ones and helpful ghosts, not the scary type. And a little girl complained to me not so long ago. She came up and said, "Sir, I like your ghost stories, but can't you make them more scary?" She said, "They're not frightening enough." So I promised I would try.
How do you make a ghost story more? Which actually leads to an interesting question. I mean, you've been writing. I mean, how many years ago was the first ghost story that you wrote?
Well, I think A Face in the Dark which you read, was one of them. No, I read. I remember back in the 1950s when I was living on my own in a small room in Dehradun, and I met a very beautiful girl. And I asked her home for tea, and we both became romantically inclined. And say we were sitting here, and I said, "Excuse me, the light switch was out there," and I said, "I'll just go and switch off the light. We'll be much happier without the light on." She said, "Don't bother to get up, I'll do it, Ruskin." And she just stretched out her arm, and it got longer and longer and longer until she switched off the light, by which time I was down the staircase and out of the house. So that, after that experience, I wrote my first ghost story.
The girl with the prehensile arm. But the reason I asked you that is because I wonder, as generations go, as people are more inclined to, the things that they're watching on television, the stories that they're seeing, is it harder to scare people more or to write ghost stories that are really eerie or spooky? Are we becoming a society that's more sort of incompatible with the need for, with the things that are required for a good ghost story? I mean, in Calcutta, when I was growing up, we had power cuts all the time, which was excellent for talking ghost stories, lamp, flickering shadows on the wall. Now, thankfully we don't have those power cuts anymore, but then less room for ghost stories also.
You're right, and it's harder to scare people or frighten people now with ghost stories, because it's really the horror story that's taken over, don't you think so, Jeet? In many ways.
Absolutely. In fact, I think it's the horror movie that's taken over, because horror movie as a genre has just, it's not just the kind of Final Destination movie, for example, which is really, their comedy is more than horror. You're always waiting to see how the disaster will strike, and it's always in a very inventive and absolutely creative sort of way that those movies kill off people. But I'm thinking of the far more effective kind of horror. For example, Claire Denis, the French, she's a kind of an film director. A movie called Trouble Every Day, where for half the film you think it's a kind of a very arty French movie, beautifully designed with a great art director, because each scene looks like a black and white still, beautiful stills for half the movie, and then suddenly there's the scene where a person is being eaten to death. It begins as a kind of a sex scene that ends with a scene of cannibalism, and then you realize it's a movie about vampires. It's a horror movie, and it's so effective. And how does a writer compete with sound, visuals, and language?
Yes, and background music.
But you actually, I mean, that reminds me. You do have the short story where, was it The Night of the Millennium?
Yes, it is a short one.
Which has a little, where you end up trying to have a romantic thing in a graveyard. This woman takes.
Yes, and she starts eating the victim, doesn't she? Well, I haven't had dinner yet, so I don't think we're going too much into cannibalism. But it is. I get scared watching films sometimes, horror films and others, because the emphasis so much very much on the gore and the violence and something to shock. And I think a lot of modern and recent films now, they take advantage of the advances in technology to create monsters and walking skeletons and all sorts of scary creatures, which in earlier films of an earlier time would have been far more difficult to create.
So but what do you think we are losing something as a result of that?
Because we are not allowed to use our imaginations now. Everything is sort of drummed into our heads.
Yeah.
Well, that was the beauty of a ghost story or even horror. When you read it on a page, half of its effect were the pictures that you made in your own head. For example, this story, the way it ends, it's up to you the particular kind of ghost or the particular kind of horror that you imagine after that last line about the watchman and the light going out, the lamp going out. And I think when you're alone in a room with a single source of light, reading a book in the dark, that's maybe as effective as anything.
We should have really been doing this session by a flickering torchlight or something. Lamplight. I mean, I really think this is what the session called for.
Or we could be doing it the way the poet Edna St. Vincent Millay used to read poems, which was she read in a black cloak holding a lamp.
Would you like to do that, Mr. Bond? In a black cloak? We could get a black cloak for you and a lamp.
No, I don't want a black cloak. No, I was thinking, I think something you said made me think of they're quite out of fashion now, but those Ouija tables where you had a three-legged table and you summoned up a spirit and you asked various questions. And a few years back, the actor Victor Banerjee said he could do this, So we got a three-legged table and sat around it and with letters, and we asked how many. He said ask questions. So I rang up my mother and he said ask her a question. So I asked, how many more love affairs do I have left in my life? And this was about 10 years back. And the answer came 13.
So 10 years back. So what's the count right now?
I still got 3 left. So sometimes there's a lighter side to these things.
But to talk also, I wanted to talk a little bit about the craft. And you'd said in the introduction to one of the collections of ghost stories that you don't have to believe in ghosts in order to enjoy a good ghost story.
True.
So in your mind, since you've written all kinds of stories, is there something different about crafting a good ghost story?
To tell you to tell you the truth, I only write ghost stories when I run out of people. And when I run out of other ideas, and then I feel I've got to write a story, and then I'll
because you can never run out of ghosts.
You can't run out of ghosts. You can always cook them up if you don't have any real spooky experiences. But I don't want to disillusion you by telling you which stories are true and which are not. So we let them all go as real experiences. And I think there have been some great ghost story writers. I started with M.R. James, and then there was Algernon Blackwood and Walter de la Mare, who wrote even poems about ghosts. And so many, Satyajit Ray wrote some wonderful ghost stories. So the list is a long one, and I believe it will continue. I'm sure people will always enjoy writing them and reading them too.
Jeet,
What do you think?
You wanted to talk a little bit about the craft, the simplicity that is inherent,
Sure. I always also was thinking that ghosts, the kind of ghosts that I'm interested in writing about, and the kind of ghosts that I'm visited by, I guess, is, and I think a state of ghostdom really is a reluctance to leave the land of the living. You die and you're not quite ready to leave. You still want to hang out with the people that you know, in the place that you know. You don't. You're in no hurry to disappear to the next realm. And I've always imagined ghosts as not evil creatures, just helpless, full of regret and longing, really. And often when you're writing about a ghost in that sense, it becomes a kind of a memorial to somebody who's disappeared.
Yes, quite true. I'd hate to leave this place, so I think I'd make a pretty good ghost, actually.
Well, I wrote down that you had a line in your book, Necropolis, where Dimple is telling Rashid that people dead do not always become ghosts. We are like dreams that travel from one person to another. We return, but only if you love us.
Exactly. Thank you. By the way, the name of the book is Narcopolis.
Narcopolis.
And of course, no, you said Necropolis, and that's completely correct because we are talking about necropolises right now.
So in that, but you also have actually had to fashion. You wrote a libretto, in which you had to have a real life ghost, if there is such a thing. What was that experience like, crafting the ghost of Babur?
I wrote a libretto for an opera called Babur in London, and it imagined the ghost of Babur having returned to contemporary London, where he interacts with 4 young people who are about to carry out a suicide strike the next day. And for me, the fun of bringing this character back and making an opera out of it, and of course, opera, really the craft is a very specific kind of craft. You learn when you're working with singers that it's all about getting rid of words, because there's, especially opera, you produce the word at tremendous pressure. It takes a lot to hit that note and to bring the word out. So you quickly learn that what you as a librettist have to do is to get rid of all the words that are unnecessary in a line. You only keep the important words. So you tend to keep nouns. You tend to keep words that have a kind of a punch to them. And I learned to do that as I was working with singers, with the sopranos and the tenors on this libretto. But for me, really, the delight of it was to embody Babur as a drunken, drug-taking bad boy. And he basically roams around the stage doing exactly what he wants and saying exactly what he feels like. So, and the actor who played him really brought that out. He spent pretty much the entire length of the libretto preparing opium pipes and saying inappropriate things. And I think Ruskin will agree with this, the delight of writing villains and negative characters is you can bring all the nasty impulses that we all try to hide. You can bring all of that out into the light. It's like bringing ghosts out into the light.
What do you, Jeet said he assumed you would agree with the delight of bringing ghosts out into the light, but yes. We'll let you speak for you.
No, you're taking me back in time to my childhood, and when I grew up as a small boy listening to my father's gramophone collection of Caruso and great tenors of that era singing, and I often wondered how their voices being captured on record, and today we can 60, 70, 80 years later still listen to them. In a way, we have captured ghosts because the very fact that we have preserved their voices is in a way we have captured something of the supernatural and made it real.
And there's something ghostly enough as it is about an operatic voice. It is a very
the resonance and the
resonates in the air, and especially when you're listening to it on vinyl, it's very effective.
And now, since a lot of people know your ghost stories very well, do you find that when you travel, you become a magnet for ghost stories? Do people want to come and share their ghost stories with you?
Well, first they always ask, is it true? Is it true, Ruskin? True, Mr. Bond, that story you've written? And I usually say, no, it's all, I made it all up.
Even when it's true.
But now I can tell you some of them are true. And people do tell me their own ghost stories, yes, sometimes. But very often they're not, they're very ordinary. I mean, they're very normal. And perhaps real ghosts are not coming appearing to frighten you. They're just going, as you say, sort of reliving the past or visiting places they've been fond of or don't want to leave, and so they very often doing the things that they used to do when they were alive. Did you think so? Huh?
I hope so. I mean,
you don't want them getting into bed with you, come to think of it.
but it's okay if they tuck you into bed, as long as they don't get into bed with you after that. But the other thing that also struck me when I was reading about ghosts, and when you started by saying that it's a lot of the English ghosts that are hanging around in places like Shimla or wherever.
Calcutta too.
And Calcutta too, of course. Is that... And some of your stories, you talk about this whole nomenclature of ghost families. I mean, we are a very family-oriented society, and so we have all these. In Bengali, we have Petnis and Brahmodoitos and Shakchunnis and Skondokata, which is so specialized that it's a ghost of people who committed suicide by putting their heads down on a railway track and a train went over their head. And so we have very specialized ghosts. And, so we could have a whole nomenclature. So what is it about us? I don't know if other countries have that kind of, they just have ghosts and vampires or werewolves and things. But we seem very, even Muslim ghosts, Mamdo boots and fishy ghosts, Mechobu. I don't know whether we're in Dehradun, there are so many different types of ghosts, are there?
No, not Dehradun. I think there's too much traffic now. The ghosts, the cars and the vehicles and the horns have scared them all away. But I was thinking of a Calcutta ghost that actually appeared in London. Charles Dickens, he'd sent one of his sons. He had over 12 sons and several daughters, and one of them joined the East India Company's army and was sent out to India. And he wasn't a very strong boy, and he should never have been sent out. And he actually, within a couple of years, he died, and he was buried here in the Bhawanipur cemetery. And I went and tried to find out more about it. And then I learned that many years ago actually. The grave was transferred from Bhawanipur to the Park Street Cemetery. But anyway, Dickens himself was reported to have said that his son would sometimes appear to him there in his home in London, back in the 1860s, and which is about the time he died here. So there is that ghostly connection with Calcutta.
Well, that's interesting because a Vietnamese American friend of mine in California used to say his grandfather was buried in Vietnam, and then the family fled as refugees to California. And his grandmother, especially as she grew older and was starting to get Alzheimer's, so she would keep wondering whether the grandfather, she would wonder, can ghosts cross the Pacific? Would the grandfather be able to come and visit her in their home in San Jose, California? And perhaps if she, according to Dickens, maybe ghosts could. Maybe this grandfather didn't want to visit her, but so he never came. But I wanted to actually open it up to question because for people to ask which story is true or not. But
or tell us your own ghost stories.
Or tell us your own ghost stories. But before that, I wanted to put a question to both of you. If you had a choice, what kind of ghost would you like to be, and where would you like to haunt?
I would like again to have a chance to meet the one whose arm got longer and longer. This time I won't run away.
Oh, because you'll both be in the same situation.
Your favorite ghost?
No, I really just want to leave when it's time. Yeah, you don't want to come back.
Don't want to come back.
I think I've given people a hard enough time while I've been alive.
Well, I hope you'll all come back tomorrow anyway over here and not be put off by this session.
I see a question already back there.
I promise not to write any more ghost stories.
No, you must not promise things like that.
Well, with that promise from Mr. Bond, I have a question that is slightly off the record from ghost stories. In your stories, Mr. Bond, Dehradun and Himalayas, they themselves play a character. What's the best thing you like about Dehradun and the Himalayas? And I have another question to Mr. Thayil also, that knowing Mr. Thayil for 3 times in this session, in this meet, you are a very realistic kind of person. From the author of Narcopolis, how do you prepare yourself for such a session of ghosts and all that? Thank you.
The first part was directed at me.
Yeah, about the Himalayas. What do you like best about the Himalayas? You write about Dehradun and the Himalayas.
Oh, I'm a nature lover really, and the living up in the mountains has helped me to actually get through life. Being close to trees, flowers, wildflowers, streams, forests, and I enjoy coming down to cities occasionally too, and it's good to have a change. So it's not particularly related to ghosts. I don't follow them around, but I must. It's very interesting. People. Somebody came to see me just a few months back, and he was investigating the paranormal, and he thought I would be an expert on the matter. He wanted me to take him around to haunted houses, and I had to sort of. I didn't want to disturb all these ghosts who were living around in different corners. So I told him, I'm sorry, I really don't know of any haunted houses here. And I didn't want to put off the tourists either.
Well, I think anybody who's experienced grief would know that there are some kinds of hauntings that you look forward to. So I would answer that question by saying that I prepared myself for a ghostly session by flying for 2 hours. I'm a very fearful flyer, and when I fly, all my fears come bubbling to the surface. I take a pill to fly, and it's a very good idea to not take a pill and to fly sober, because that brings you right up against all the ghosts that are clamoring to get in from the window of the plane.
Other questions? There's a question.
Good evening, everybody. Should I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Good evening, everybody.
I don't think your mic is on.
Is it working?
Hello, Mr. Bond. Basically, we know that a person died, and after death, his spirit became ghost, if it is not in an improper state, okay? But if it is possible, if a space, the space itself is dead, but space itself has certain kind of consciousness, and after a certain period of time, this space itself has become the ghost. We know the infestation, which is called infestation. Space itself has become ghost. Is it possible?
Well, thank you. You've given me an idea for a story. Yeah, why shouldn't it be possible? Yes, well, interesting. Yes, a ghostly space. Certainly, we'll talk about it later.
Good evening, everybody. This is not really a question, but an experience that I would like to share with everybody out here. Actually, I have done my PhD on Ruskin Bond, and I had been to Mr. Bond with my husband long back in 2005 to take an interview. And I remember carrying with myself a small tape recorder. But while I was like climbing up Landor, it suddenly, I realized that it was not working anymore. So there was a shop out there which used to repair electronic goods, and I went and said that I need a tape recorder because I have to, get this interview recorded. And so there was a man who said, "Oh, आप Bond साहब के घर पे जा रहे हो? ठीक है, ये लेके जाओ." So it was a big, huge tape recorder he had given me, and we both had taken it, me and my husband, to Mr. Bond's house. And I said, "Okay, now I'm going to record, this conversation." And he was very glad. He said, "Okay, fine, carry on." So as the tape was rolling gradually, and probably for 45 minutes, when I had continuously asking him questions, and then suddenly that's one side was over. So Mr. Bond just said, "Why don't you just check out if it is, working fine?" So I just tried to check out, and you wouldn't believe there was not even a single sound recorded in it. And Mr. Bond, with his cheeky smile, said, "There is a ghost out here, who will not let my voice be recorded."
Yes, I have this ghost. He hates tape recorders, he hates anything, and all these technological things. He gets into them, and it's a mischievous trait.
Thank you so much. That's all I wanted to share.
And he also hates. Is that why you don't have a cell phone?
In spite of that, you managed to do your PhD.
Yes, I did, sir. You know that. Thank you so much.
Good evening, Mr. Bond. I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
In the early 70s decade, when Prem Singh came to stay with you, you had written in one of your articles that Prem Singh's wife used to have fits at night. She used to give out shrieks as if she was possessed by a spirit, and then you would ask them to spend the rest of the night in your room until that thing passed over. What is your take on that?
Well, yes, she used to get possession and it would pass off. That happens to many people up in the hills, actually, get possessed by the spirits of people who've passed on. It's not very rare. It does happen occasionally.
My second question is a little off track. In many of your articles, you've written about your extended family. Prem Singh and his children, Rakesh, Mukesh and Dolly and their children. So I would like to know who have accompanied you to Calcutta on this tour. Is it possible to introduce us to them?
Well, they're here, but they're very shy, two of them. I'm not sure that they'll want to come up on the stage. Rakesh, Beena, would you like to say hello? They're probably at the back somewhere.
Yes, can you please come up on the stage?
I don't know if they want to come up. If you want to come up, of course, you're very welcome. But meanwhile, let's go take another question.
In the meantime,
Yeah.
Good evening. I just wanted to know, psychologically speaking, can we actually appropriate pastness and memory with ghost?
Give me the tough ones. Did you say pastness? Is that what you said? Pastness?
Yes, I said pastness.
I like that word. I don't think it exists, but it should. You just coined a word. Good on you. I might write that down and use it.
See, good things come out of literary festivals.
In fact, I think the title of the session could be The Pastness of Ghosts. Or Sleeping with Ghosts. One of the two. I hope that's good enough of an answer.
A very good evening. My question to you, sir, is that do you like the ghosts that we see in Harry Potter movies, like nearly Headless Nick, or do you think that they're too friendly to be ghosts?
Is there anything as a too friendly ghost?
You answer that.
Me, No, you are the ghost. No, you are the paranormal expert. People are coming to you to do.
Yeah, but I'm not familiar with the Harry Potter films, actually.
Why are you outsourcing the difficult questions?
I like the, let me paraphrase that question. Let's leave Harry Potter out of it and ask you, you said many ghosts are friendly. Is there such a thing as a too friendly ghost? I mean, is there a level
I think we're now back to the question of sleeping with ghosts.
My question is to Mr. G. Very often we confuse between spirits and ghosts. So what is actually the connection or the dissimilarities between spirits, ghosts and charasis?
Spirits usually exist in bottles, and after you use those spirits, you see the ghosts.
Good evening, sirs. The talk was supposed to be about ghosts, charasis and black widows. So could you elaborate on the latter two?
The Black Widow?
The black widows and the charasis.
My bad, I did not get to all the components of our ghostliness.
Well,
do you want to take the charasis and I'll take the Black Widow?
No, I'll take the Black Widow. I'll take the Black Widow, which that story I wrote, Susanna's Seven Husbands, which was made into this film. I forgot. Saat Khun Maaf. And she was a real person, and it's the idea for the story I got from many years back. Up the Hooghly, that there were three settlements: the French at Chandanagar, the Danes at Serampore, and the Dutch at Chinsura. And along the highway from Chinsura on one side, a little way off the road, there was, it might still be there, a very large monument which said, sacred to the memory of Susanna Anna Maria de Witt. It's a Dutch name, and there was a long epitaph in Dutch. And I spoke to some of the, and there was a ruined mansion behind, and I spoke to some of the people who lived around there in the village, and they all said that this lady had a reputation. She'd been through several husbands, and whenever she discovered that one of them was a fortune hunter or after her money, she'd get rid of him in some ingenious way, like putting a cobra into his bed, or giving him poisoned mushrooms for breakfast, or locking him up in a room and then going off on a holiday, and coming back and finding his skeleton there. So I worked all this into this story, which later became the film.
What do you think of the film?
Now,
what do you think of the film?
It had some, Priyanka Chopra made a great, she carried the role off beautifully, on her own shoulders. Perhaps, she was the best thing there.